before we took the break, we listened and sampled what some of the viewers had to say regarding the news that has been on the headline. And there was a lady who was saying that sometimes we tend to exaggerate. And I was coming to you, Victor, and we do know the saying that if it bleeds, it leads, basically. And in regards to your thoughts on her comments, whether we exaggerate, but it also weighs into what you are saying. There's a lot more. That newspaper has a lot more in the pages that is there, but mostly people stick to what's in the first maybe 3 or 4 pages.
Which is very sad, because we don't over-exaggerate. Journalists are trained people. There is, I mean, before Standard reaches this headline, it's not Mike who just wake up and put there. There are editorial meetings, conferences where people discuss. People fight over headlines, editors over. So it's not a simple thing like somebody just wakes up and places things. So there's a thought process that goes into, by the time a decision is made for a newspaper or a TV station to lead with news, there's a process. And this thing is what I've talked about. People must allow editors and journalists to exercise their professional discretion. And sometimes these programs are good, and we're encouraging media houses to open up public editors so that they help people, media literacy on how decisions are made before stories are picked. This helps, it will help people to start understanding so that we avoid this pedestrian criticism of journalism. Everybody has become an expert on how media should have done this and not. And you ask them, if media is that easy, why can't you open a media house yourself and start one and we'll see how it is. But we appreciate criticism. Professional criticism is healthy, it helps in peer review, but it's not that journalists exaggerate. But be aware also that journalists are human beings. In one case, we make mistakes, and people make mistakes, and whoever made mistakes, sometimes we correct. And sometimes internally, how many people are suspended every day for mistakes they make? Right. But we don't announce them. So people must appreciate that journalism, but remember, journalism is a high-pressure job. That things happen so fast that sometimes we make, but let's make criticism. Journalists are not obsessed with trivialities. Journalists go through a thought process. People plan stories. People look at what their competitors are doing, what stories they carried yesterday, what feedback they are getting from their online platforms before they decide on which stories to go with and lead with.
All right, Evans, you're a journalist. There is not enough of good news, according to some. Your thoughts or your comments on that?
I think the impact and influence of news media on crime and victimization is what is very critical. And we're listening to what the lady was talking about, that she's been watching TV and everything is about murder, murder, murder. I think journalists need to understand that that impact. And I think Victor will agree that there's guidelines on how to report crime or crime reporting. And mostly is that victims or even family members and friends of victims are often sometimes find themselves at the crossroad of media competition, where sometimes stories even come out before they have been informed. Or sometimes stories come out without seeing the trauma that the stories can cause to the victims. And that is also something very important. And we see also the profiling of the stories. I mean, when you're doing a feature story, for example, breaking news on a crime story, this is something you're actually going on ground when it's happening, when the families of the victims are still on trauma. And the way you report it also can have an impact to the victims. Looking maybe a feature story where you need to gather a lot of information, but also not forgetting that the high-profile stories where you need, where maybe the story is going, like what is happening now is like a high-profile stories on crime, where the social, the political, the cultural impacts of these crimes to society are what are being enlightened, as opposed to just competition among the media. So I think also the public need to be very fair, as Victor says, when it comes to criticizing how the media is bringing out this kind of stories.
All right, Dr. Nyabuga, as you still weigh in on that, let's now look at the actual stories that we've been covering. And the headlines, of course, for the last, let's say, week and a half, has been that of Monica Kimani, and of course, the twist being in by just how things have happened, and some may call it murder most foul. But your thoughts on the coverage so far on that particular story?
The arguments in various platforms that the media is pandering to fear, that there's fear news all over. And this is based on the fact that newspapers must sell, news must sell. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. Sensationalism sometimes is good in terms of capturing the people's attention. But sensationalism is bad when it's not accompanied by substance and facts. And I think this is what people are actually looking for. And as I said earlier, if you look at a newspaper, for example, all the pages of the newspaper, I think mostly they're good news. So the bad news are, balanced out by maybe bad news and good news, sometimes balanced. And sometimes this is what people actually are interested in. As we know, one of the key determinants of good news to media is bad news. Bad news relating to murder, bad news relating to accidents, and such issues. So sometimes we don't want to be elitist in terms of prescribing what people ought to consume, what people ought to be interested in. Of course, it is important that newspapers and media houses focus on genuine public interest issues. And that is what they are always looking out for. So if you look at the newspapers, for example, all of them today, the Standard as police pursue four friends Irungu called for advice, and there is a similar story in The Nation, Monica's Juba links. And the good thing with these headlines is that there's a constant follow-up, and this is something that newspapers have been accused of not doing, that there's not much follow-up on stories. But for the last 2-3 weeks, I think we've seen headlines on these young people that have been killed, and related stories. And I think this is what interests the public. We shouldn't assume that we know better what interests the public. But as Victor said, I think it is important to leave the work of journalism to professional journalists.
All right.
Because there are various factors that inform a news selection in the first place.
Victor, your thoughts on the substance of this story? Because sometimes we are caught, and maybe that's where sometimes the public lynches as media, between the sensationalism and creating substance. What should be the main thing that we'll be looking at in this story? Because there are several things that come into play. We have a murder most foul, basically. We have the players also are of interest, and especially the journalist Jackie Maribe, of course, bringing this to the headlines by virtue of the fact of her position. You also have Monica, who is a pastor's child, but running a business in South Sudan, but again, now other links coming up. What should be the main thing we'll be following up here?
I think that lives that have been lost, that can't be. We can't move away. Look at the Obado story, look at the Monica story. Lives have been lost. And these lives have been lost and never come back again. So that's something we must look at. Circumstances that led to this death, both as a story, but both as a lessons. What are the lessons? I mean, when somebody tells you I'm in Dubai or Juba doing this, what are the issues? So those are things that we must look at. I mean, we are already talking about corruption in this country. The issue of illicit flow of money is a major thing. When people say there are a lot of South Sudanese in the country or other tribes in this country who have so much money, and the people are asking these hordes of money. In one of the newspapers, there was a story where people are walking with huge amounts of money in boots in the vehicle because of the new banking rules. And when we are talking about inflation rates, what are the implications of that? So already when KRA is talking about falling revenue collection, when people are moving with money like this in cash, obviously it has implications on revenue collection. So to me, that's a huge story in the sense, illicit flow of finance, lifestyles, like we were talking about. What are our daughters and sons doing outside there? I mean, people have asked, when somebody brings you 100 million in your house and you never ask, where from this? The obsession with materialism across the board, that people want to make it quick, that we never even ask. So to it, it's a crime story in itself, but it's also a social lesson for people to start learning. But the other thing also is the issue of brand management. I mean, the story of Jackie and Red just looks at, given the work you do, the issue of brand management is very important. How you present yourself, how you preserve yourself, whatever. Because this is just one case. I mean, there are other colleagues who we find in a very compromising position, might not be related to this, and you ask him, Guy, do you remember you work for Standard? And then say, oh, so the work we do also has a determination on most of these companies, and we were talking about this thing yesterday. We have internal rules where they say once the brand of any company or institution is in repute, this would happen. So we need to be aware that the work we do, preserve our brand, is very important. Brands make or break people. And if you look largely at what interests, like you're mentioning, it has been the brand. What is the perception of people towards journalists, for example, or particular journalists, for example? And how has this perception been built? Is it a real? Is it perceived and artificial, so that even the way you relate with colleagues at work, the way you do your work, the way it has, a bearing.
An impact.
Yeah, it has a bearing in your other related things. So, so the issue of brand management becomes very important, and obviously the issue of risk analysis. I mentioned it. Journalists are exposed by the virtue of their work, exposed to a lot of people. They meet presidents, they meet thugs, they meet everybody, and so it calls upon that because of this big exposure to the many people you meet, you need to raise your level of risk awareness and assessment of friends and network.
Okay. Evans, crime reporting, because this is what has been on the headlines. Now we have the case of Monica. We also had Sharon, who, you know, again, these are crimes that have been committed. But have we stayed on the, what I'd call the main thing of the story?
Victor forgot to talk us about people printing money in their houses. Anyway, I think what is important is from this story is also the interest of the victims or the rights of the victims, and especially victims and family and friends. Because when we just report this and not look back at the real connection between
the victims and the families as well.
Because that really misses out. Because mostly you'll find that maybe even relatives and friends of these victims really probably want to say something, and maybe they have not talked something, or maybe they have been caught in the middle of the stories. And I think it's important when we report on high-profile murder cases like these ones, is that we also put the interest of the victims at hand, so that they also be able to get justice. Because sometimes you'll find a case might appear high-profile. It's not the first time we have had murder cases in this country, high-profile murder cases, and they just disappear. Because what people concentrate on, who did it, who committed the murder, but not what is the rights of the victims.
Of the victim, and what happens after that.
Yeah, what happens after that. And many people will say, because it's so-and-so, the case will disappear. Because it's so-and-so, the case will just disappear. But we must actually be able to interrogate the interest of the victims to get justice.
All right, gentlemen, we'll need to wind up soon, so I'll need your closing comments, but maybe staying with that main story. I'll start with you, Daktari. Your thoughts on what really we should be following up on from here, because there could also be what we'd call viewer and reader fatigue when you're on the same story. Not to say that we should drop it, but I'm not sure whether it should still be on the headline, and what should we be following up from here, from your thoughts?
I think one of the things that maybe media houses and journalists haven't done is interrogate the consequences of some of these headlines on the psychological and mental health of Kenyans, and how sometimes continuous coverage of these issues desensitizes us of crimes such as homicide or murder. And consequently, maybe it is important to try and frame these stories differently. But, in the last few days, we started to see maybe media houses moving from one story to another as a way of maybe drawing links or trying to investigate some of these murders. But there's so many other stories in this country that ought to get headline space and prominence and such matters. Issues of referendum, for example, and how that is going to affect Kenya's development, economy, socio political issues. I think those are matters that maybe should be given more prominence now, and maybe the murders ought to move to the inside pages. But nonetheless, these are interesting issues that get us to think about what are the values in this country, values in terms of what it is that we privilege. Material wealth, as Victor said, seems to be something that occupies.
All right, Victor, your closing remarks.
And I would love to see any of these newspapers and the TV with splashes of journalists who have been harassed, beaten, and their cases have never been picked up. I mean, how do we ensure that journalist colleagues who have been, and the number is now 47, and nothing has ever happened? Can we influence an agenda around the issue of investigation, prosecution of perpetrators of harassment of journalists, and a number of them, people like Ruben Ogachi who was broken his leg, has now a metal in his head. I mean, somebody like Isaiah going in Siaya right now, we are trying to see psychological. They were traumatized by what he went through. So if we could get a story, I mean, just a splash on the number of journalists, what they went through, and what has never been happened. I'll have to, and obviously a follow-up on the Big Four agenda. How are we doing? I mean, I would love, because all our attention and the legacy projects around the Big Four agenda, how are we doing? I'd love to
All right. Evans, your closing remarks.
Michael, have you ever imagined that one day the perpetrator of these crimes against journalists, his photo and his story is on the headline of a newspaper, whether he's a junior most police officer, and he can earn a full page or maybe the headline with his picture, to shame, to be able to expose that these are the people who are behind abuses and violations against journalists. That would be more interesting than also just trying to talk about the journalists themselves, but also let's also talk about the perpetrators, to be able to shame them, to be able to just bring them out. And I think they will be held to account. And more importantly, I want also maybe also to see relatives, family, parents of the victims of murder being able to be given a voice in the newspaper. That should be.
Thank you very much, Ivan Zofula, who's a journalist, Victor Bwire, Programs Manager, MCK, and Dr. George Nyabuga, who is a media and communications lecturer at University of Nairobi School of Journalism. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us in the newsroom this morning. And, well, that's where we wind up the newsroom, and we are now going to take a look at